Part 17, Realm and Commonwealth by Spiers. Copyright 2018. Article 16. Information Bureau enjoy the privilege of free carriage. Letters, money orders and valuables, as well as postal parcels intended for prisoners of war or dispatched by them, shall be exempt from all postal charges in the countries of origin and destination, as well as in the countries they pass through. Presents and relief in kind for prisoners of war shall be admitted free of all import and other duties, as well as any payment for carriage by state railways. Article 17. Officers taken prisoner shall receive the same rate of pay as officers of corresponding rank in the country where they are detained. The amount shall be refunded by their own government. Article 18. Prisoners of war shall enjoy complete liberty in the exercise of their religion, including attendance at the services of their own church, on the sole condition that they comply with the police regulations issued by the military authorities. Article 19. The wills of prisoners of war are received or drawn up in the same way as for soldiers of a national army. The same rules shall be followed as regards documents concerning the certification of the death, and also as to the burials of prisoners of war, due regard being paid to their grade and rank. Article 20. After the conclusion of peace, the repatriation of prisoners of war shall be carried out as quickly as possible. Chapter 3. The Sick and Wounded. Article 21. The obligations of belligerents with regard to the sick and wounded are governed by the Geneva Convention. Section 2. Of hostilities. Chapter 1. Means of injuring the enemy, sieges and bombardments. Article 22. Belligerents have not got an unlimited right as to the choice of means of injuring the enemy. Article 23. In addition to the prohibitions provided by special conventions, it is particularly forbidden: A. To employ poison or poisoned weapons. B. To kill or wound by treachery individuals belonging to the hostile nation or army. C. To kill or wound an enemy who, having laid down his arms or no longer having means of defence, has surrendered at discretion. D. To declare that no quarter will be given. E. To employ arms, projectiles, or material calculated to cause unnecessary suffering. F. To make improper use of a flag of truce, of the national flag, or of the military insignia and uniform of the enemy, as well as the distinctive signs of the Geneva Convention. G. To destroy or seize enemy property, unless such destruction or seizure be imperatively demanded by the necessities of war. H. To declare abolished, suspended, or inadmissible the right of the subjects of the hostile party to institute legal proceedings. A belligerent is likewise forbidden to compel the subjects of the hostile party to take part in the operations of war directed against their own country, even if they were in the service of the belligerent before the commencement of the war. Article 24. Ruses of war and the employment of measures necessary for obtaining information about the enemy and the country are considered permissible. Article 25. The attack or bombardment, by any means whatsoever, of undefended towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings is forbidden. Article 26. The officer in command of an attacking force must do all in his power to warn the authorities before commencing a bombardment, except in the cases of assault. Article 27. In sieges and bombardments, all necessary steps must be taken to spare, as far as possible, buildings dedicated to public worship, art, science, or charitable purposes, historic monuments, hospitals, and places where the sick and wounded are collected, provided they are not being used at the time for military purposes. It is the duty of the besieged to indicate which such buildings or places by distinctive and visible signs, which shall be notified to the enemy beforehand. Article 28. The giving over to pillage of a town or place, even when taken by assault, is forbidden. Chapter 2. Spies. Article 29. A person can only be considered a spy when, acting clandestinely or on false pretenses, he obtains or endeavours to obtain information in the zone of operations of the belligerent, with the intention of communicating it to the hostile party. Accordingly, soldiers not wearing a disguise who have penetrated into the zone of operations of the hostile army for the purpose of obtaining information are not considered spies. Similarly, the following are not considered spies: soldiers and civilians entrusted with the delivery of dispatches intended either for their own army or for the enemy's army and carrying out their mission openly. To this class likewise belong persons sent in balloons for the purpose of carrying dispatches and generally of maintaining communications between the different parts of an army or a territory. Article 30. A spy taken in the act shall not be punished without previous trial. Article 31. A spy who, after rejoining the army to which he belongs, is subsequently captured by the enemy is treated as a prisoner of war and incurs no responsibility for his previous acts as a spy. Chapter 3. Flags of Truce. Article 32. A person is regarded as bearing a flag of truce who has been authorized by one of the belligerents to enter into communication with the other and who presents himself under a white flag. He is entitled to inviolability, as also the trumpeter, bugler, or drummer, the flag bearer, and the interpreter who might accompany him. Article 33. The commander to whom a flag of truce is sent is not obliged in every case to receive it. He may take all steps necessary in order to prevent the envoy from taking advantage of his mission to obtain information. In case of abuse, he has the right temporarily to detain the envoy. Article 34. The envoy loses its rights of inviolability if it is proved in a positive and incontestable manner that he has taken advantage of his privileged position to provoke or commit an act of treachery. Article 4. Capitulations. Article 35. Capitulations agreed upon between the contracting parties must take into account the rules of military honour. Once settled, they must be scrupulously observed by both parties. Chapter 5. Armistice. Article 36. An armistice suspends military operations by mutual agreement between the belligerent parties. If its duration is not defined, the belligerent parties may resume operations at any time, provided always that the enemy is warned within the time agreed upon, in accordance with the terms of the armistice. Article 37. An armistice may be general or local. The first suspends the entire military operations of the belligerent states, the second between certain portions of the belligerent armies only, and within a fixed zone. Article 38. An armistice must be notified officially and in good time to the competent authorities and to the troops. Hostilities are suspended immediately after the notification or at the time fixed. Article 39. It rests with the contracting parties to settle in the terms of the armistice the relations which may be allowed in the theatre of war with and between the civil populations. Article 40. Any serious violation of the armistice by one of the parties gives the other party the right of denouncing it, and even in case of urgency, of recommencing hostilities immediately. Article 41. A violation of the terms of the armistice by individuals acting on their own initiative only entitles the injured party to demand the punishment of the offenders, and if there is occasion for it, compensation for the losses sustained. Section 3. Military authority over the territory of the hostile state. Article 42. Territory is considered occupied when actually placed under the authority of the hostile army. The occupation extends only to the territory where such authority has been established and is in a position to assert itself. Article 43. The authority of the power of the state having passed de facto into the hands of the occupant, the latter shall do all in its power to restore and ensure as far as possible public order and safety, respecting at the same time, unless absolutely prevented, the laws in force in the country. Article 44. A belligerent is forbidden to compel the inhabitants of territory occupied by it to furnish information about the army of the other belligerent, or about its means of defence. Article 45. It is forbidden to force the inhabitants of occupied territory to swear allegiance to the hostile power. Article 46. Family honour and rights. Individual life and private property, as well as religious convictions and worships, must be respected. Private property may not be confiscated. Article 47. Pillage is expressly forbidden. Article 48. If, in the territory occupied, the occupant collects the taxes, dues, and tolls payable to the state, he shall do so as far as is possible in accordance with the legal basis and assessment in force at the time, and shall in consequence be bound to defray the expenses of the administrator of the occupied territory to the same extent as the national government had been so bound. Article 49. If, in addition to the taxes mentioned in the above article, the occupier levies other money contributions in the occupied territory, they shall only be applied to the needs of the army or of the administration of the territory in question. Article 50. No collective penalty, pecuniary or otherwise, shall be inflicted upon the population on account of the acts of individuals for which it cannot be regarded as collectively responsible. Article 51. No contribution shall be collected except under a written order and on the responsibility of a general in command. The collection of the said contribution shall only be effected in accordance as far as is possible with the legal basis and assessment of taxes in force at the time. For every contribution a receipt shall be given to the contributories. Article 52. Requisitions in kind and services shall not be demanded from local authorities or inhabitants except for the needs of the army of occupation. They shall be in proportion to the resources of the country and of such a nature as not to involve the inhabitants in the obligation of taking part in military operations against their own country. Such requisitions and services shall only be demanded on the authority of the commander in the locality occupied. Contributions in kind shall as far as possible be paid for in ready money. If not, a receipt shall be given and the payment of the amount due shall be made as soon as possible. Article 53. An army of occupation shall only take possession of cash, funds, and realizable securities, which is strictly the property of the state, depot of arms, means of transport, stores and supplies, and generally all movable property belonging to the state, which may be used for military operations. Except in the cases governed by naval law, all appliances adapted for the transmission of news or for the transport of persons or goods, whether on land, at sea, or in the air, depots of arms, and in general all kinds of war material may be seized, even if they belong to private individuals, but they must be restored at the conclusion of the peace and indemnities must be paid for them. Article 54. Submarine cables connecting an occupied territory with a neutral territory shall not be seized or destroyed except in the case of absolute necessity. They also must be restored at the conclusion of peace and indemnities paid for them. Article 55. The occupying state shall be regarded only as administrator and usufructuary of the public buildings, landed property, forest and agriculture undertakings belonging to the hostile state and situated in the occupied country. It must safeguard the capital of such properties and administer them in accordance with the rules of usufruct. Article 56. The property of local authorities, as well as that of institutions dedicated to public worship, charity, education, and to science and art, even when state property, shall be treated as private property. Any seizure or destruction of, or wilful damage to, institutions of this character, historic monuments and works of science and art, is forbidden and should also be made a subject of legal proceedings. Number 1. UKTS 1900, number 11. CD 800. Hertzlet 23, page 534. SP 91, page 988. USTS 403. 2. The convention was signed for United Kingdom, including Australia, 18th of October 1907. Instrument of ratification deposited 27 November 1909. 3. The convention entered into force for Australia and generally 26 January 1910. Soldiers' Law 135. The English Civil War represents a stage on the way to modern codified rules that regulate, still with very partial success, conduct in war. English practice in the 1640s, with its striking mixture of harshness and restraint, reflected a reality that later codifiers and theorists have continued to grapple with: the demand of military necessity and of moral criteria having continued to coexist uneasily. Lieber's Code of 1863 for the Union Army in the American Civil War, the direct ancestor of modern international codes of war, struggled to distinguish between what military necessity admits and does not admit, and the secular humanitarianism of the 19th century, like the biblical culture of the 17th, accepted starvation and bombardment of civilians as weapons in the service of military necessity. The preamble to the Hague Convention, number 4 of 1907, recognized the intractability of the problem in its declaration of purpose, which was to diminish the evils of war so far as military requirements permit. The codes of war forbade many evils, but they also sanctioned many. One of the dismaying lessons of war is that we, as well as they, can lapse into barbarism and inhumanity, and modern examples have shown the difficulty of accepting such a concept of ourselves. Part of the horror and fear that they arouse stems from recognition of how easily the veneer of civilization can be lost. The 30 Years' War had forced Englishmen to admit that good Protestants could behave as badly as depraved Catholics. This sense of the fragility of the standards and bonds of society, civilian as well as military, lay behind the pervasive rhetoric of the Civil War that reiterated the basic and universal standard of human conduct derived from God and nature that was endangered by war and, above all, by the actions of one's enemies. Consider this clip from Soldiers' War, wherein it discusses the progression from the English Civil War through the Lieber Code and on to the Hague Conventions 1907. From the civil war that led to the Commonwealth of England under Oliver Cromwell and the St. Edward's crown being stolen and melted down by parliamentarians of the day, the beheading of Charles I, and the following trials of the king killers, we see that the practice of modern warfare has its roots in practice at the turn of the 1600s. The New World and King James I, along with the authorised King James Bible, installed as the laws of England in 1611. This period of history is unique, and for the Commonwealth of Australia, post-Civil War, and the effect it had on the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland financially, the first talks of federation in 1875, Hansard Records of the House of Lords in London. During the struggles post-American wars, with several treaties leading to the Geneva Conventions, US field orders or rules of engagement, and the Imperial Crown engaged in India, the Commonwealth of Australia was born amidst an unusually large power struggle. Post-Hague Conventions 1899, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was suffering financially, and the burdens of warfare over the century before were beginning to hit the home fronts. The Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act July 1900 UK/PGA stood through debates of federation, a vote for the consensus of that federation, and during an era of workers going on strike, causing the formation of the Labor Party, which today lacks the lustre of its original form. 282 to 288 Rules of Land Warfare. 283 Functions of Government. All the functions of the hostile government, legislative, executive, or administrative, whether of a general, provincial, or local character, cease under military occupation, or continue only with the sanction, or, if deemed necessary, the participation of the occupier or invader. 284 Nature of Government. It is immaterial whether the government established over an enemy's territory be called a military or civil government. Its character is the same, and its source of its authority is the same. It is a government imposed by force, and the legality of its acts is determined by the laws of war. During the military occupation, it may exercise all the powers given by the laws of war. 285. The laws in force. The principal object of the occupant is to provide for the security of the invading army and to contribute to its support and efficiency and the success of its operations. In restoring public order and safety, he will continue to force the ordinary civil and criminal laws of the occupied territory which do not conflict with this object. These laws will be administered by the local officials as far as practicable. All crimes not of a military nature and which do not affect the safety of the invading army are left to the jurisdictions of the local courts. 286. Power to suspend and promulgate laws. The military occupant may suspend existing laws and promulgate new ones when the exigencies of the military service demand such action. We need to consider now the Commonwealth of Australia, although an idea for the previous 32 years, had only been a Commonwealth of Australia constituted, proclaimed, gazetted, and enacted by the 1st of January 1901. Within 7 years, there is a link to a convention relating to the customs of warfare of war on land. Several rules of land warfare have come into play that are relative to the governance of the Commonwealth of Australia, now under peace treaty to foreign powers. This is an important time worldwide, and the Hague Conventions 1907 frame what we know as the world today, with a few twists and turns along the way. The American Civil War and those backing Abraham Lincoln had formed the rules of engagement that would carry on for almost 2 centuries. Turning back on the empire, we find a situation where financial creditors have an interest in nearly a third of the world and a power base that outweighs the rest of the world. Let's return to the scope of the paper and reflect on what this means for the Commonwealth of Australia. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was suffering the burdens of the wars of 1812 and 1863. Although in Australia the colony of New South Wales was divided into smaller colonies, including Victoria and Queensland, aptly named in sovereign term. By the 1850s, the colonies, now 6, were given acts of self-governance, separated by law from the motherland, yet tied at the hip in faith. The colonies in Australia had been propping up the motherland with the profits of sugars, wools, grains, and other produce. The motherland profited from its exploits in the realm of the previous convict era. When the Civil War affected the Bank of England financially, the Commonwealth suffered at the hands of the labour force that kept all the products arriving at ports, strikes from the ports, through the railways, on to the industries themselves, such as the sheep shearers. When the Commonwealth of Australia formed in the defence of the motherland, the people had their hearts and minds in a union, voted upon all the colonies, and through debates on federation. It was a common news of the day. Flags were flown, speeches made, and people rallying to and for the Union. It set the heart of a nation in motion, its spirits flying high, and then an armada arrived on their doorsteps. After the Hague Conventions, where you can see by the list of plenipotentiaries, the King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland had been a signatory to the Hague 4 War on Land series, adopted into the Commonwealth of Australia in the Australian Treaty Series on the 26th of January 1910. The Commonwealth of Australia had only been formed as a constituted body of the people in 1900. And here we are at the hands of United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, thrust into a convention by way of the King becoming signatory to administration under the rules of usufruct. And in the months following, the US naval fleet arrives in the harbours of the Commonwealth. As can be seen by both presented postcards of the 1908 visit, the flag is presented with a 6-pointed star. The shield presented on the card to the right was issued by royal warrant in 1906, although as shown earlier in this paper, conflicts with the 6 pointed star as shown here on the shield pictured centre. The flag of the Commonwealth of Australia changed in 1908, coinciding with the visits of the US Naval Fleet post Hague Conventions 1907, wherein at Article 55 of the Hague IV War on Land details the administration of the Commonwealth of Australia under the rules of usufruct. Article 55. The occupying state shall be regarded only as administrator and usufructuary of public buildings, real estate, forest and agricultural estates belonging to the hostile state and situated in the occupied country. It must safeguard the capital of these properties and administer them in accordance with the rules of usufruct. This had stayed in line with what was previously a part of the United States Rules of Engagement for Orders in the Field, the Lieber Code, wherein at Articles 31 and 38 it details the same. 31. A victorious army appropriates all public monies, seizes all public movable property until further direction by its government, and sequesters for its own benefit or that of its government all the revenues of real property belonging to the hostile government or nation. The title to such real property remains in abeyance during military occupation and until the conquest is made complete. 38. Private property, unless fortified by crimes or by offences of the owner, can be seized only by way of military necessity for the support or other benefit of the Army for the United States. If the owner has not fled, the commanding officer will cause receipts to be given, which may serve to the spoliated owner to obtain indemnity. It is interesting to note, and it explains why the nation barely notices such change unless they are aware of the significance, is that at Article 1 and 2 of the Lieber Code, it is declared a martial law and there need be no announcement of the change of powers. 1. A place, district, or country occupied by an enemy stands, in consequence of the occupation, under the martial law of the invading or occupying army. Whether any proclamation declaring the martial law or any public warning to the inhabitants has been issued or not. Martial law is the immediate and direct effect and consequence of occupation or conquest. The presence of the hostile army proclaims it is martial law. 2. Martial law does not cease during the hostile occupation, except by special proclamation, ordered by the Commander-in-Chief or by special mention in the Treaty of Peace concluding the war. When the occupation of the place or territory continues beyond the conclusion of peace as one of the conditions of the same. When one begins to comprehend what martial law actually is, you will begin to understand that you have been living in a state of martial law your entire lives, its existence in the Commonwealth of Australia tainted at its very creation, a separation by constitution from the motherland, and yet entangled by faith in the very social fabric of the empire. We have ceded Australian sovereignty over matters of peace and war to the United States. We must recapture Australian sovereignty and a sense of strategic independence. We must never again allow the circumstances to exist in which one man has the capacity to commit Australia to war. The late Malcolm Fraser, former Prime Minister of Australia. The Crimes Act 1914 comes about through the Parliament of the Commonwealth of Australia as the men of the realm volunteer its defence in the Australian Imperial Forces, earning them the honour of being Commonwealth of Australia Defence Forces, and the Commonwealth went off to the Great War 1914 to 1918. The sheer fact that the Commonwealth of Australia had lost 60,000 men in a world war in front of all other nations had sealed the Commonwealth of Australia by self-determination. Billy Hughes did in honour speak for their deaths, the largest per capita of any participant within the Great War. Billy Hughes just voiced for the men of the Commonwealth of Australia what the blood of the Anzac had done for him on the battlefields abroad. This set a slightly different stage in the war. The Commonwealth of Australia was now seen unto itself before other nations in a war room talking about peace. The Commonwealth of Australia would now be seen responsible for its own peace declarations. 4.35% of repatriations of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, while already under the rules of usufruct of a peace treaty earlier, likely prodding the Commonwealth into a war in the first place. The Treaty of Versailles 1919 were many treaties between attending delegates, some taking months and years to finalise. As a collation of treaties, the Treaties of Versailles saw delegates discuss the rules of land warfare and the distribution of repatriations and debts for the war. Billy Hughes returned to the Commonwealth to rally peace loans to help pay off that final agreement. As the peace treaty, the discussions of the League of Nations began to take form. The United States administration of President Taft had coined the idea of the League, yet it wasn't the administration of President Woodrow Wilson that it would come to fruition. From the moment people gained independence, they had a claim to and possessed the right of self-determination. They are sovereign over their affairs. See the Covenant of the League of Nations, Article 10, and the Chapter of the United Nations, Article 2, paragraphs 1 and 4, together with resolutions 2131 XX 1965 and 2625 XXV 1970. Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act July 1900 UK/PGA, enacted after a vote of the colonies, put in motion self-determination. Anzac had sealed that before the international world, in defence of a realm that afforded them the foundation for the Commonwealth of Australia. Prime Minister and Commonwealth Attorney General, together with Sir Joseph Cook, signed the multi-layered Treaty of Peace at Versailles in France in June 1919. The Empire had already begun to think about its structure in conferences within the Empire in 1917, with Lord Balfour expressing his plight for the Jewish homeland, and now the Commonwealth was joining a League of Nations 1919. We seem to have been structured around the United States-centric administration, wherein the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland is central to wars of interest to financial powers involving the United States of America and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, resulting in the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and the Treaty of Ghent in 1812. As an end result of having King Edward VII as delegate to the Hague Convention, signing Hague for War on land installed as law in the Commonwealth of Australia on 26 January 1910. Within the year of signing the multilateral agreement at The Hague in 1907, the US naval fleet is heading into Commonwealth of Australia and British naval waters for a visit to Australia in 1908. This is followed by a change to the flags of the Commonwealth of Australia by Admiralty Order in 1908, from a 6-pointed star to a 7-pointed star, setting up for the Flags Act 1954, some 46 years later. Following a war in defence of a realm already entwined in administration, the Commonwealth of Australia is sealed in self-determination by the 60,000 of 5 million of Australia's population left across the battlefields abroad. Now the Commonwealth of Australia is embroiled in a worldwide League of Nations. What this had started was food control, from the food bowls of the planet to the mouths of those around the world, in turn becoming sustainable development to a League of Nations still playing the rules of engagement. Woodrow Wilson put the final signatures to the multilateral agreements at Versailles in 1923, setting in motion everything that was agreed upon in the peace agreements. Within the Commonwealth of Australia, this set in motion debt-sinking funds and interaction with the Treasury and the then Commonwealth Bank of Australia and its governor being part of the Commonwealth of Australia and not a privatised institution. The Commonwealth of Australia published these events in newspapers of the day and informed the population of the events post the Great War. A self-determined Commonwealth of Australia under the realm of the Imperial Crown sucker-punched into warfare and subsequently repatriations that it had struggled to get out of post-war, causing agreements of peace to be put in place. It is not up to this paper to speculate on the events leading into World War I, although from the aspect of the Commonwealth of Australia and its links to the Lincoln-style system of administration based in the Hague Conventions, the US visits of their naval fleets and the change in the naval ensigns of the Commonwealth of Australia are surely too much of a coincidence. The Commonwealth of Australia joining the League of Nations in 1919 is without question. Many will question the sovereignty of the Commonwealth of Australia post the Covenant of the League of Nations being signed, although few will consider Hague Conventions leading to the Great War in the first place. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland went through the Balfour Declarations and the Imperial Conferences of 1926, leading to Great Britain, Ireland, Australia, and Canada becoming separated. The Parliament of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland taking parliamentary title to United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Yet is all what it seems. Under Hague Conventions, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland became signatory to administration under rules of usufruct, or use of the fruits, and the US naval fleet is visiting the Commonwealth of Australia. Within the United States, the U.S. administration issues executive orders on the 8th of April 1933, ordering all persons to deliver all gold coin, bullion, and gold certificates now owned by them to the Federal Reserve under the punishment of a U.S. $10,000 fine or 10 years of imprisonment. The United States of America was embroiled in the same problems that the Commonwealth of Australia was through the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland being a signatory to the Hague Conventions. The United States of America being put under the same agreements to administration under rules of usufruct, as can be demonstrated by the list of signatories, a new era from the post-President Lincoln style battlefield. The executive order posed the return of said gold before the 1st of May 1933, a large prospect for such a large population to deal with after the issue of the orders dated 8th of April 1933. What was happening in the United States of America was happening rather quickly, as the House Joint Resolution followed only a month later on 5th and 6th June 1933. The United States had literally issued order for the confiscation of the gold bullion throughout America, and by House Joint Resolution had declared the payment of gold against public policy and against the public interest. It had literally run out of gold. Had they been administered in rules of usufruct for participating in the wars of the 1800s at the hands of borrowed gold? The Commonwealth of Australia was in similar dire straits going through Debt Sinking Fund Act 1923, and it links to the Commonwealth Bank and Treasury. The Commonwealth installs Financial Emergencies Act 1931 and follows in the footsteps of the United States towards a petrodollar and the removal of the gold-backed standard in 1971 when Gough Whitlam discusses the problem with the United States President Richard Nixon. This bankruptcy of the independent and the empire, embroiled in a war of anti-slavery through the 1800s, were both suffering financial collapse in sync with each other. The United States had run out of gold, as had the Empire and the Commonwealth of Australia. An agreement of peace had put in motion not only a League of Nations, but what would lead to the International Monetary Fund 1947 and the introduction of United Nations Trust Territories, along with citizenship in the Nationality and Citizenships Act 1948. Considering everything that had taken place at the turn of the century and the beginning of the Commonwealth of Australia, it links to the debts to the Empire and its financial collapse along with the United States of America and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Do you think Tony Abbott's contract with Australia to end waste and debt will come to fruition when they keep the debt cycle turning by using credit to build modern roads and improve services as well as to create 2 million jobs within 10 years? Clearly, this is a lie. Clearly, the Commonwealth of Australia is tied to a trustee system of the United Nations post-World War II after being embroiled in the Treaty of Versailles and League of Nations. This is demonstrated in the Nationality and Citizenship Act 1948 and again in the changes to the Australian Citizenship Act 1973, post changes to the Oath of Allegiance by Queen Elizabeth II and to Constitution obeying laws and duties rather than to Queen Elizabeth II as per Oath of Allegiance taken by the Governor General of this Australia, not in accordance with Letters Patent 1900. The League of Nations had set food controllers in place as operations of peace under the multilateral agreements, and post World War II, this was no different. The Commonwealth of Australia adopting United Nations food management in 1944, as we have explained 2 years prior to the official forming of the United Nations as a body. 2.3 Post World War II development of a framework for international arbitration. The outbreak of World War II halted international business. However, its immediate aftermath saw huge economic growth and trade, particularly from the 1950s onwards, when global commerce between private parties began to flourish. This was stimulated by various post-war initiatives at the international level, including the establishment of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later renamed the World Bank, and International Monetary Fund in 1944, and the establishment of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, usually called the GATT, in 1947. 2.3.1 1958 New York Convention. Perhaps the most important milestone in the entire history of international commercial arbitration was the adoption of the New York Convention. Its completion in 1958 cannot be viewed in isolation as a sudden act of innovation. It was a product of the developments described above and the further lobbying by the international business and legal communities since the early 20th century. The ICC played a significant role in the lobbying process of the 1950s, including submitting to the United Nations a preliminary draft convention on the recognition and enforcement of international arbitral awards and agreements. The ICC's proposal for an international award that was not subject to any control by the courts of the place of arbitration proved to be unacceptable to most states. The United Nations Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, instead produced its own draft convention for the enforcement of foreign awards. ECOSOC's draft was debated by representatives of some 40 countries at the Convention of International Commerce Arbitration, also known as the New York Conference, held at United Nations headquarters in New York on 20 May to June 10, 1958. After the first week of this conference, the Dutch delegations submitted a substantially altered version of Article 3 to 5 of the ECOSOC draft. Therefore, the conference continued its deliberations using the Dutch proposal as the basis for discussion. A working party was appointed and prepared to revise draft in light of the discussions. This version was further modifications was adopted by the conference in June 10, 1958 by 35 votes to none with 4 abstentions. This has increased to the adoption of conventions related what everyone knows as Agenda 2130 and to governments being dubbed sustainable development. This is the food controllers at work, working the division of the food bowls in one country for the use in another. This extends out to manufacturing and has turned making countries dependent on outside sources for the survival, with manufacturing collapsing at home. Government de facto, a government of fact, a government actually exercising power and control in the state as opposed to the true and lawful government, a government not established according to the constitution of the state or not having lawfully entitled to recognition or supremacy, but which has nevertheless supplanted or displaced the government de jure, a government deemed unlawful or deemed wrongful or unjust, which nevertheless receives presently habitual obedience from the bulk of the community. Australian Journal 324. Our contract with Australia. Real solutions contract. 1. A stronger diversified economy. 2. Carbon tax gone. 3. End of waste and debt. 4. Build modern roads and improve services. 5. Stop the boats with proven policies. 6. 2 million new jobs within a decade. Signed, Tony Abbott, Liberal National Leader, and Andrew Laming, MP, Liberal National for Bowman. The International Monetary Fund set up a fund for the use by nations of the world. The Commonwealth of Australia setting agreements in place in the International Monetary Fund Act 1947. As a requirement of the loan of funds, the Commonwealth of Australia created citizenship and trust territories, in which the wealth of the nation, its ability to borrow funds, was based on the backs of the people. Here we have acts relating to the allegiance of a people creating trust agreements with the United Nations. Post a world of two wars, League of Nations turning into the United Nations, the Commonwealth of Australia participant from its inception after an act of self-determination at a war in the years before the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. In the scope of the current topics, it is of interest to reflect on the change in the flag from 6 points to 7 points post-Hague Conventions, followed by a visit of the US Naval Fleet, which has led to Pine Gap in 1967 set up under a peppercorn lease. One of Queen Elizabeth II's first actions upon her visit to open the Parliaments of the Commonwealth of Australia was the Royal Sign Manual on the flag, changed in 1908 Admiralty Orders. Following the Royal Powers Act 1953, conferring powers to the Queen through the Governor-General and appointing the Governor-General power from the Queen, we have the legislation of a flag changed by Admiralty Order only 5 years after flag issued by Edward VII in 1903. This doesn't even take into consideration flag, voted on by the people in 1901 and chosen as the federal flag and then adopted as the national flag. The change in flags, even from the people's chosen design, along with the notion of a federal flag being adopted as a national flag, puts a national flag in separate meaning to a federal flag. Yet, the change post-Hague Conventions, now being legislated some 37 years later, has great significance. To back up this, we have the 50-cent round following in the design of the florin, now removed of its imperial crown and replaced with the 7-point star on torso. The torso is worn under the crown. We have the demise of the de jure currency in silver and the addition of a 7-pointed star to the coat of arms on display of what was the largest silver-modelled tin base coin. A change in flag in 1908 from a 6-pointed star and a change in the coinage from an imperial crown to a 7-pointed star, both relative to the demise of the function of the Commonwealth of Australia. The 1908 change matched by a show of force in the US Naval Fleet's demonstration of power in the Commonwealth of Australia, and the 1966 change to the coinage in timing with the demise of the use of the St. George Cross as the naval ensign of His Majesty's fleets. The actions leading up to 1966 can be demonstrated to have been rules of usufruct based in international laws of armed conflict that have been affecting the United States and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland going back almost 200 years, being at conflict in the Americas since declarations of independence. An international theatre has been set, and you are thrust into the world of military occupation and slavery. The deciders have decided you will do what they have decided you will do. From food controllers to military interventions, the world has been locked down by sucking the value out of entire kingdoms, making everyone play a game of credit in a world where what is created is and always has been the value. In the next edition, we will look into realm and man.